So good morning, everyone. My name is Jody King. I am a contract specialist with the Alaska PTAC, and I am here this morning to talk to you about teaming strategies. We're going to kind of talk about the evaluating, expanding your business capacity this morning. But before we get into the webinar, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. First of all, I want to pull everyone's attention to the GoToWebinar panel and point out a few things. As you notice, when you join, everyone is muted, but we do have a small group today, so I'd like to encourage conversations, questions, and the more that we can interact, the better. You can do this in one of two different ways. You can click on the question box and type in your question at any point in time, or if you are on a mobile device or just don't feel like typing, you're more than welcome to just click the raise hand, and I'll be happy to unmute you from my end, get to unmute yourself from your end, and go ahead and have those conversations. So very easy to do, so I'd like to encourage that conversation and ask those questions. The next thing I want to point out is the handout section. So I do have a copy of the slides, and there's some links that you'll want to make sure that you get. So you can download the slides from the handout section. And again, if on a mobile device or unable to download the slides, feel free just to reply to your webinar invitation and let me know that you'd like a copy of the slides, and I can send those out to you. Next thing is this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on the ptacalaska.org website, most likely by Monday afternoon. It should be on under the training events, under the on-demand. So if you want to go through this again, that information's there. So do keep that in mind, that since this is being recorded, if you do get the open mic, just be aware that we are recording. So with the housekeeping done and said, let's go ahead and move forward. So a little bit about PTAC, just in case you're new to our program. So PTAC is a federally funded grant program. We have a cooperative agreement with the state of Alaska, and we are housed at the UAA Business Enterprise Institute. So that is kind of our legal structure, but here's the pertinent points that I'd like everyone to remember. Is PTAC provides free assistance with all aspects of government contracting from cradle to grave, start to finish, for federal, state, and local purchasing activity. We provide free one-on-one appointments, and of course we have our free workshops like the webinar being held today. The Alaska PTAC is one of 90 other PTACs across the US, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And so if you have a business with multiple locations, I'd like to encourage everyone to click on that second website, the ptac-us.org, and check out the other locations, because while all of us focus equally on the federal contracting arena, we are each experts in our own backyard for those state and local contracting opportunities. And so if you're expanding into a new area, already have branch offices, or you're thinking about expanding, it's great to check out those local PTACs and see what they have, especially since all of us are coming out of the COVID restrictions and are just now getting back to a point where we can have in-person events again. And then we can see what other network and opportunities are going on across the US. So worth checking out. So let's move on. And again, if nothing else, remember PTAC is that free help if you have questions. We're a great starting point. All right, so today we're going to talk about business positioning, teams versus joint ventures. We're going to look at the FAR guidance because it kind of does help understand and give the parameters of what we're talking about when we talk about different teaming strategies. We're going to talk about limitation on subcontracting, and then we're going to go into a kind of a company self-assessment where we look at ability, capability, and capacity, and then we're going to talk about looking for potential partners. So let's discuss business positioning. So this was based on a great couple of articles. They're a little older, but I thought they still had value and worth checking out. They're both a pretty short read. But a company's relative position within its industry matters for performance. So strategic positioning reflects choices a company makes about the kind of value it will create and how that value will be created differently than rivals. So as you can see, we're not necessarily just saying in government contracting, but your business positioning in general. So positioning is all about who you say you are in the marketplace to build the types of relationships your business needs for success. So really that is all right there, building success by building relationships. And that's what this webinar is about. And then of course, we'll talk about the different venues, but really we're going to be talking about building business relationships. So when I say building business relationships, there's a couple of different ways we can do that from a structural level. So we're talking about prime subcontract relations, because of course this is a government contracting class. So ultimately the goal is for businesses to gain business success through successful completion of government contracts. And so we're going to talk about how do we do that to expand outside our own capacity. So we can do this in a couple of different ways. So again, prime subcontract relationships with a contract performance, that similarly situated limitation on subcontracting, and subcontracting plan requirements. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in depth as we move through the presentation. There's also teaming agreements, which are kind of those I understand that you're going to do this and that I'm going to do that written document that kind of helps outline that can be used going either for that prime sub or going further down our list. They kind of roll into those master subcontract agreements. We have mentor protege agreements and of course, joint ventures. And for all the time that I've worked with PTAC, joint ventures is the most overused phrase, but a lot of people don't really understand what all that implies. And so we're going to kind of talk about that too, why people say, oh yeah, you should JV, you should have a joint venture, go get a joint venture, you know, joint venture with other people. So it's become this verb as well. And we'll talk about that just a bit more. All right. So you had to bear with my long pauses. Allergy season has started, so much pauses for drinking of water while talking today. All right, next slide. So prime sub versus joint ventures. And this is some information that I pulled from a presentation. You can see their logo here, Co-Prince McCall Potroff LLC, and I'm going to give you the link for the Govology class where this was first presented. But I like how they split this out. So let's do some compare and contrast. So the prime sub, only one party, the prime, performs at the prime contract level and is responsible to the government. Whereas a joint venture, both parties perform at the prime contract level and are responsible for the entire contract. So it's about performance responsibility at what contractual level. On the prime sub, subcontractors typically paid on a predetermined basis. So those where we get into the teaming agreements that roll into subcontractor, or some of the larger primes have those master subcontractor agreements. So we have our terms and conditions, and what we're going to do is already predetermined even prior to award. In a joint venture, parties typically split profits and losses, also on a kind of a predetermined part of building that joint venture. No new legal entity is created in a prime sub. They remain two separate hierarchies. The joint venture, parties create a new legal entity, whether they do it as an LLC, a partnership, a corporation, and that new entity is registered in SAM versus that prime sub where the prime, of course, has to be registered in SAM. Subcontractors not necessarily have to be registered in SAM, although there is that responsibility for a prime contractor to ensure that their subs meet the qualification from a legal concern, not been debarred or banned from government contracting, don't have any key personnel, And the best way for them to be able to guarantee that is by looking at those completed reps and certs. So in most cases, your large primes are not going to do business with you as a subcontractor if you don't have that SAM registration. Subcontracting limits back in the prime sub. Subcontracting limits apply to prime only, but note similarly situated entity rule, where subcontracting limits apply to the JV as whole. So it talks about performance. So just a little quick, and we do have a slide on that similarly situated. But what that means, so the biggest difference on that responsibility of performance and that limitation is subcontracting. So let's talk about it now, and then we can always kind of readdress it when we get back to that particular slide. So when we are talking about, let me get my, here we go. So when we're talking about this prime sub and we're talking about levels of performance, so the responsibility in a prime sub relationship, the prime has that one-to-one government privity, that privity of contract. And subcontractors then, if they have concerns, really are reliant upon their subcontract agreement and working up towards those responsibilities with that prime contractor. When we talk about these subcontracting limits, and note that similarly situated, that the federal government has set limitations of % of performance, and the contractor has to perform that percentage of performance, whereas a joint venture, again, those can be split. And that was a little odd, but I just remembered I do want to go ahead and do that on that particular slide where I can show you the percentages. So let's talk about the FAR guidance. So we kind of, briefly addressed that there is a difference. A joint venture, where the biggest thing where people get confused is there is that creation of a third entity. So here's how the FAR defines teaming arrangements. So the contractor team arrangement as used in the subpart, and this is FAR 9.601, 2 or more companies form partnership or joint venture to act as a potential prime contractor, or the potential prime agrees with 1 or more other companies to have them act as its subcontractors. So the FAR does recognize that definition of the partnership or joint venture. FAR 9.602, the contractor team arrangements may be desirable from both a government and industry standpoint. They complement each other's unique capabilities, and they offer a government best combination of performance, cost, and delivery for the system or product being required. So contracting officers have this guidance within the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Requirements, that state, hey, this is a good thing. And so part of that, building that team is, again, right here for both the government and for the business, is to complement each other's unique capabilities and offer the government the best combination of performance, cost, and delivery for the system or product being acquired. Now note here, the FAR just says team arrangements, although it's defined it as one of these 2 different processes. The next 9.603, it says the government will recognize the integrity and validity of a contractor team arrangements, provided the arrangements are identified and company relationships are fully disclosed in an offer, or for arrangements entered into after submission of an offer before the arrangement becomes effective. So now we're talking about in solicitation, sometimes you'll see that if this is a joint venture or a teamed approach, the contracting officer wants to approve the joint venture, or you have to give notice of joint venture. And we'll talk a bit about that more down the road. So let's talk about teaming agreements before we really get into all of the differences between joint venture and the mentor-protege and all the various different structures. Let's just talk about teaming agreements. So as we mentioned, the prime is the has that privity of contract. It's a one-to-one relationship between the government and the prime contractor. So with that privity becomes all of the responsibility of ensuring that the work is performed as outlined. And of course, they have the responsibility for all of the subcontractor performance as well. When it comes to teaming agreements, note the FAR does not require prime subcontractor teaming agreements, but the benefit of having those teaming agreements is to ensure that there are no misassumptions that who's going to provide what or do what. The procuring agencies sometimes, perhaps increasingly, require teaming agreements to be submitted with proposal because it outlines again those responsibilities, and it shows on paper that the parties involved in this said teaming agreement, in this team process, have really thought out and have thoroughly outlined the various details to make sure that all of the needs of the federal agency through the completion of that contract are going to be met. These agencies may decline to consider a subcontractor's past performance capabilities without a teaming agreement. So we're starting to see things along the line that in the case of a prime sub relationship, that only the prime contractor's past performance is going to be considered. A great example this time last year, we had the paving MATOC come out, and right within the solicitation document, it stated that even if the companies are going to have a teamed approach, the agency is only using the past performance of the proposed prime for purposes of evaluation and determination of awardee. So often when we talk about building our teams, because again, as noted in that previous slide, the FAR listed out, we're looking at ways of extending our performance and our capabilities. So often if that is the case, where if the company cannot do the completion of the scope itself, then we are looking for that additional assistance. And if we are not necessarily in a position as a company that we want to hire additional employees, especially if there's just small components where you need those outside expertise and not necessarily a full-time position for the performance of that contract, then of course we're going to be looking at, well, how can we team or partner with other companies or do this prime subcontractor to bring in those experts? So when we talk about that, developing that, what is it that we need, this is where those teaming agreements come in. It outlines those understanding of who's going to do what. And tying it into, then again, we're notifying in writing if the teaming agreement is requested as part of the proposal, that we are showing that one, the prime isn't necessarily unduly reliant upon their subs to be able to complete the work, but also that they're using it to further support that prime's ability to complete those contracts. So teaming agreements, let's hop down to this next one. The value of having a teaming agreement is they help lock in commitments from prospective teammates. So again, as we mentioned from that very first moment, this is really about building business relationships. And of course, having a teaming agreement is really putting that business relationship in writing and documenting it in paper. So if we are uncertain, and often we'll hear from subcontractors where they have given the same quote for their services to multiple primes, because whoever gets that award, they want to be able to get into that. But there's also this uncertainty if they're looking at a prime and that prime says, hey, we want exclusivity. We want you, if you are working to be on our team, we don't want you bidding for other teams as well. And this is where having a teaming agreement might help assure that, well, if I am not going to be spreading those bids across multiple companies to increase my chance at a part of that contract, dependent, by spreading that opportunity across multiple primes, if I'm being asked to just stick with one prime, having that written teaming agreement to help lock in commitments gives a sense of security. One of the things that I want to state about teaming agreements is they don't necessarily have the same legal weight as a subcontract document, but they can be used for proof of intent of that prime if they go and say, yes, absolutely, we want you to just work with us. I'm pulling together a bid packet, and then post-award, they wind up going to another subcontractor for those same goods or services. So it does have some legal merit as a documentation, well, because it does lock in that intent of the prime contractor. And as we kind of mentioned here, the prime doesn't want to rely on a prospective subcontractor's qualifications and resources only to have a subcontractor decline to participate. So that locking in commitment really does help protect both that prime and that subcontractor. And again, here we kind of just restating the subcontractor, of course, doesn't want to spend time and energy on a proposal only to not receive a subcontract. So part of these teaming agreements establishes rules, if any, for exclusivity. So we kind of just discussed that. It also helps to avoid difficult post-award disputes, because when the teaming agreement should be your pre-subcontract agreement. You're not just looking at who's going to perform what, but how are you going to handle changes within performance or notification or dispute resolution or payment. All of this teaming agreements are your way to pre-discuss how the contract itself is going to be executed. And it helps you demonstrate with compliance with key requirements. And again, this kind of ties back to that if we're using that as a required document for your proposal submittals. So in a prime subcontract, we talk about subcontract agreements. So this is where those teaming agreements then get rolled into your subcontract. Now, again, I already mentioned this, but some of the larger prime contracts might have master subcontract agreements that are a template or a kind of a shell for a subcontract that can then be modified, edited, modified for each particular subcontract opportunity. But for purpose of the workshop, let's just talk about it here. So teaming agreements roll into subcontracts, and teaming agreement is the chasing the contract document. The subcontract is performing the contract document. So that's kind of the biggest difference. Again, the teaming is that understanding of this is what we're going to do for award. The subcontract is now we have the award, and it should also include, of course, all of the roll down clauses required from the federal solicitation for the federal contract. A subcontract is more detailed. It does include the project and or scope specification, where a teaming agreement may have a more general for performance intent. A subcontract must include the mandatory FAR provisions. And here we talk about that flow down is a provision of a prime contract that the prime contractor includes in the subcontract. These are mandatory. FAR clauses, FAR required primes to flow down many clauses, and failing to flow down these clauses required is a breach of contract. So some of the things might be simple as being an equal opportunity employer, security requirements for base access. So it just depends on the particular agency. Most of the general solicitations that apply to the prime also apply to the subcontractors as well. One of the things that's not necessarily a flow down requirement is termination clauses and contract modification clauses. In fact, often those can be overlooked from a prime to sub relationship. Those are not necessarily, and it's not necessarily the benefit of the prime to take those FAR clauses that allow that privity of contract, of that contract modification, changes in government contract, and the disputes clause, and roll that down to their subcontractors word for word. Now, from a subcontractor perspective, your subcontract should have language that addresses how do we handle change, how do we handle termination for convenience, how is the prime going to handle termination for cause, how is the prime going to end a not successful subcontract. That language should be there, but it isn't necessarily stating that you should take that FAR language word for word and flow that down too. So the subcontract agreement is a negotiated agreement, and it should be specific to a singular contract activity. Subcontractors should be ready to push back against non-compliant terms. Often I've worked with a lot of small businesses, and they are concerned. They don't want to push back. They don't want to negotiate these opportunities because they want to get in and start doing business with those prime. They need that past performance. They need that experience of getting on a government contract, and they'll sign just about anything and assume good faith ever. But the subcontract is a negotiated agreement, and you should be ready to push back with confidence. And the things that you want to really look at is the scope of work should be specific to avoid disputes. Sometimes it's just there's a sub roll down and maybe they attached your quote as part of that supporting documentation to prove scope. But has that changed any since contract award? Was there any pre-discussion on what you were performing, or is your quote by chance sufficient to have included that? Payment and invoicing provisions should also be included. The FAR prime contract is going to have a payment clause. This is really for that construction, that paid when paid language that states that the prime contractor is required to pay their subcontractors within 7 days of being paid. And now the one I'm thinking of course, is really a construction contract. But often primes and subs really don't have that discussion. Do you need to wait until the prime gets to invoicing your performance, your portion of that, before paying? Or can you negotiate that you get paid within a certain set time after completion of your area that you performed? All right, so quick question. Does the Alaska PTAC help with the agreement reviews and ID areas for negotiation? Yes, but keep in mind, we PTAC folks are very aware that we are not attorneys. So if you want a preliminary review of a subcontract, or if you're developing, absolutely, we'll be happy to look at that. You can reach out to myself or Craig Von Holt, Pierre, any one of the three of us. But keep in mind, depending on the complexity, we are not attorneys, especially not business attorneys that specialize in government contracting. We may not catch absolutely everything, but we're a good start point for a discussion to help you outline your questions and then reach back out. So it depends on the project, the complexity, but often until if you do not have your own. So short answer, yes, we can look at it. Long answer is even if you discuss team arrangements or subcontracts with PTAC, don't forget you might want to also seek that legal advice as well. Okay, let's see if I can continue talking without hurting myself. All right, sorry about all of those interruptions. And hopefully I muted enough you guys didn't have to listen to any of that. All right, so back to our negotiated agreements, things that you want to talk about. Again, those dispute resolution, termination provisions, and that difference between termination for convenience and default. Non-disclosure provisions ensure compliance with subcontracting limits, and of course the term of subcontract. How will the prime address contract options? So depending on the contract, if there's a bridge contract, How is that going to be included? And really, more importantly, how are you going to be able to sit down and negotiate prices for additional work or changes to scope? So keep that in mind as well. All right, moving forward. So limitations in subcontracting. When we talk about the prime sub world, this is where this really kicks in. So when does it apply? So any full or partial small business set aside with a value greater than the simplified acquisition threshold, which is now 250,000. So obviously, if we have a full and open competition, limitation of subcontracting really doesn't necessarily kick in. But when we have a set aside, whether small business, of course, women-owned, the hub zone, 8A, service disabled veteran, the goal of that set aside is to make sure that that small business is benefiting from completing that scope of work. And by benefiting, they're receiving that financial benefit of completing that contract. So the last thing the federal government wants is for these pass-through opportunities where maybe you have a small prime with a very large business as their sub, and then the large business just gives a finder's fee or a one-time payment to the prime, and then they do the entirety of the work themselves. So that is the intent of these limitations of subcontracting, is to avoid that, to make sure that those funds truly are going to the small business. So what it means is that the prime has to perform a percentage based on whether it's service, construction of the contracts. So, oops, one more time, I'm going to mute myself. Sorry about that. All right, let's see if I can keep this going without big long breaks. All right, so limitation on subcontracting, it states that for services, except construction, will not pay more than 50% of the amount paid by the government for contract performance to subcontractors that are not similarly situated entities. For my slides here, for supplies, we have 50% as well. General construction will not pay more than 85. That means the self-performance is 15%. And then construction by special trades, performance will not pay more than 75%, so performance is 25%. So let's talk a little bit more about similarly situated. This concept came into place quite a while ago, but really was only within the last 18 months or so, maybe not quite 2 years, that the FAR definition was finally finalized and incorporated. So when we say similarly situated, and of course, keep in mind that this is applied for those small business set-asides, it means that a first-tier subcontractor, including an independent contractor that has the same small business program status as that which qualifies as the prime contractor. So, and of course, is considered small for the size standard for that NAICS code. So what that means is if we had a woman-owned small business set aside, and the awardee then, of course, is a woman-owned business, that for those first-tier subcontractor, if that is also a woman-owned small business company, then the performance of the two can be applied for the requirement for the performance of the prime. So if we were saying here as a service contract, so let's just say janitorial, for example, that if we had that woman-owned small business janitorial contract, and then we can't subcontract more than 50%, but if the first tier is also a woman-owned subcontractor, then again, that level of effort is merged towards the prime meeting that 50%. So what that really does encourage is for those primes, when they're building that teaming and they're looking at that subcontracting, if you are looking at a prime sub relationship, paying attention to that socioeconomic designations of your potential subcontractors as well to help support you in meeting that performance goal. So it really does help support that program overall. Any questions on that? So again, this has been in place for quite a while, but it's finally made the FAR language. And before, the limitation of subcontracting didn't address that similarly situated. All right, so let's talk about privity of contract. So again, that one-to-one relationship between government and prime contractor. So if we're looking at a particular solicitation and we feel that the past performance requirements or the complexity of the contract itself, that scope to complete, is a little bit outside of our immediate company's abilities, and sure, we can bring in that subcontractor, but if we feel that it is a better approach, that we have a stronger position to form a relationship on a more, bring that up from a prime sub into developing some sort of joint venture with another company. So when we're looking at that, then we are basically marrying those two companies to create that third, in which that past performance then can become a little bit complicated. So in some cases with a JV, let me give you one of the downsides. Often when we talk about past performance, and you're going to do this as a JV, the agency wants to know, well, what has the JV done itself for past performance, as opposed to what is the past performance of the two parent companies that have gone in to create the joint venture. And so when you're looking at a solicitation, if there's language about that past performance in the solicitation phase, ask those questions and get clarification and try to get them to support the joint past performance of the two parent companies in that creation of a JV. So when we talk about the development of this JV, let's look at this from a SBA, so that form and registration. So the SBA regulations require that a joint venture, one, must be in writing, typically done by the way of a joint venture agreement, and also must be registered in SAM. So this is going to be an absolute, you have to be registered in SAM for that legal entity. Now, I don't know if either of you have been in SAM lately with that new process, from that changeover from DUNS to that unique entity identifier, but there's a few hiccups in their process, and so it's slowing it down. With just the SAM component in mind, a JV is not going to be something that magically happens overnight. And often people don't really think about that lead time when they're developing those joint venture agreements. Just like any business development, you're creating a whole third company. There's a lot of things that have to be in place. So part of that, again, that joint venture agreement, getting that in writing, there has to be a bank account, that who's going to pay for what, how are you financing, how are those profit and losses going to be applied to those ownership? Is there going to be an equal ownership of 50-50? Are we doing, a 51-49 because we're trying to carry over certain socioeconomics, such as an 8A? Also, does that joint venture need approval before it can be realized? And so again, think of through that 8A program. And some of that has changed where not all joint ventures have to be approved, especially those tied to the 8A program. A lot of that had to be approved prior to being able to be awarded for a joint venture. Again, a lot of those requirements has changed, but pay attention to that solicitation in time. So just that business development is a time consideration plus the SAM registration. The next thing I want to point out is that small business requirements, a JV qualified as a small business. A JV qualifies as a small business as long as each member of the JV individually falls below the applicable size standard. So this is a change from the old SBA rule in which the venture size were sometimes added together for determining size. So it was one of those for applicability of the JV to be able to go after small business set-aside programs. So that is very recent, that change, where as long as both entities were small, now as a JV, they get to keep that status. They're no longer affiliating the two companies and looking at all of those as joint income for that size concern. There are still issues with affiliation that you have to be aware of. The best webinar, honestly, the best way to really get a good grasp on affiliation is if you go to the ptacalaska.org website, and under our on demand, we had a presentation by Matt Schoonover on affiliation. Fantastic, well worth an hour of your time to sit through his webinar, because he really talks about all of the ins and out of potential affiliation and how that developing of a JV might be beneficial from a contract perspective, but how you might then in turn hurt yourself through affiliation and lose your size standard as small for other solicitations. So we do have that definition of affiliation, and that's where, again, there's a couple of different types: that size of the JV, small or other than small. So if you do joint venture where you have a large company, of course you will lose that status as a small business. And of course, under the affiliation, we have that ostensible contractor rule, where there is so much reliance on that partner that one prime might not even be able to perform without that particular partner. So depending on that JV, and this really gets into that if you're developing, that partnership, that LLC, that incorporation, when you start to split up ownership percentages, if the smaller of the company or that has that socioeconomic then takes that higher percentage to be able to keep that socioeconomic tied to the JV, but then it is SBA is determined that that prime is so completely reliant upon their minority partner for being able to complete, then we might have those ostensible contractor rules. A lot of ins and outs of that, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it now. Instead, what I really like to do is go ahead and just tie that back. Again, take a look at the PTAC website, look at the affiliation webinar. It's really fascinating. Matt's a phenomenal speaker. It's well worth the time to take it to sit down and watch that. All right, so joint ventures under mentor protege program. So the value of a mentor protege program, and I don't spend a lot of time on this in this webinar, is the mentor protege, the intent was for these two businesses, the mentor and the protege, they come together, you complete a mentor protege application. The most common one now is SBA's All Small Mentor Protege program, although there are multiple various federal agency mentor protege programs as well. But most people, when they think mentor protege, they're thinking about the SBA's All Small Protege. And the value of that is it removes that size affiliation from being a concern when that mentor and the protege are then forming a joint venture to go after specific work. So because I'm not really going to spend a lot of time going into the legalities of JVs and mentor protege practices, what I do want to offer you instead is more resources specific to those. So if you are looking at how do I create a joint venture, or how do I develop that teaming document, if you're looking for more of that legal approach, I'd like to recommend our Govology webinars. So PTAC has a subscription with Govology, and we offer that access to our subscription for our active clients. That means with our PTAC discount code, and it's 2202AK. Actually, let me throw that in the chat real quick. So I've added our discount code. That means that you can go into Govology and take any of these classes for free by using our discount code. Most of them are $75 up to $225, but heck, free beats that anytime. So if you just use our discount code, and that does change January 1st of every year, and then, but these webinars are absolutely fantastic. So I've gone through all of these and do recommend them. If you're looking for much more, these are all presented by attorneys, and so they really do talk about the ins and outs and the legal details that is a little bit beyond my comfort level for advising you for developing joint ventures or teaming agreements. This three-part series, this compliant and effective teaming agreements, is again the most current. It was just made available. The live was about a week before that, so that's now available as of March 31st. And I really encourage to take a look at those. All right, so we kind of talked about the basic approach to prime sub, what's a prime sub versus teaming versus joint venture, where we go into that formalized. But I want to turn the tables for a moment and talk about, why do we want to team with another company? What is it that our business is needing to make the effort of building those business relationships with other company, whether for purposes of expansion or for those filling those need areas within our internal operations? Why do we want to reach out and increase that risk of starting to do performance jointly with other companies? So why team with another company? The reasons are, that physical capital, human capital, intellectual capital, or financial benefits. So often there is something that we need that either it's just cost prohibitive, or from a business standpoint, again, versus hiring, bringing on a professional full-time, or even hiring them, for performance of a particular contract, when there's really only a small component of what you need for that overall performance. So this article that I have listed here and linked was a really great, talked about the 8 reasons to consider collaborating with another small business. And I thought it was an outstanding article and a lot of great information, but I pulled the 4 that I thought worth discussing during our webinar today: that physical, human, intellectual, and financial benefits. And we can really apply this not only just from a teaming, we talk team, subprime, or prime sub, joint ventures, but mentor protege. So let's talk about that for just a second while looking at those 4. So when we're talking about a mentor protege program, what we are, especially if we're thinking about being the protege, is we're obviously looking for a company that can help us pass some sort of growth hurdle, whether that physical, access to finances, human expertise, that intellectual capital. Again, we're looking at the company that has great success in winning contract awards. They've got that proposal process really dialed in. If you're in the construction business, maybe they have those higher bonding capacity that you're struggling with. So usually what we're looking for is assistance for business growth from that protege. And so we're looking for the mentor that can then help offset that need so that your company can grow. Well, from a mentor perspective, they're looking for a protege that's going to offer them some sort of business access as well. Same thing: physical capital, human capital, intellectual, financial benefits. So again, if you are a small business and you have that 8A certification or able to obtain 8A certification or HubZone or any of the other set aside, then there is that benefit that you're allowing access. You are offering a carrot. There's a reason for that company to then join with you and to develop that relationship. You can identify your needs, but you can also identify what you have to offer to these other companies. So what we're really talking about when I say company self-assessment, it's like, what do you do well versus your competitors? What are those differentiators? So this is when I tend to kind of date myself, but I don't know if any of you are familiar with those old SWOT analyses, that SWOT, that strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. And when it had its heyday as a buzzword, probably, quite a few years ago, but it's still a really valuable document for identifying what is your company doing well? What is its strength when you're looking at your position? And we've talked about positioning, the beginning of this all, but within your position of your industry within your market. What are your threats? Where do your competitors have that past performance, have that access that you don't, that they're already doing that you don't have? And do we want to look at those competitors as potential teaming partners? What can we offer them so that they can share what they have one up on you? Again, where can we benefit? And that opportunity, strength, opportunity, SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. Where's that opportunity in that teamed approach? What can you guys do together that neither one of you can do separately? And that could be just going over larger and going after larger opportunities and allowing both of you that growth potential. So let's talk about that. So what are we offering? So let's talk about ability, capacity, and capability. So ability is that skill, knowledge, or power to do something, whereas capability is the ability to do something in either or scenarios. The capability of a business refers to its ability to do something when all its resources are optimally employed. Capacity is that innate potential. The business capacity refers to the maximum level of output that it can yield and deliver within inherent limitations. So this is the example I like to use. I've remodeled my craft area. I'm very proud of it, got wallpaper up, and I bought this beautiful new ceiling fan I've yet to install. And I am looking at myself from that business perspective. I have the ability to install that ceiling fan. I could watch the YouTube videos. I know how to use tools. I have the basic understanding of electricity and wiring. So I have the ability. I could become more capable through education and again, YouTube videos and install it myself. But looking at my capacity, my innate potential, is it worth my time and effort to go through that growth process to do it myself versus bringing in that expert to do it for me? And I can tell you absolutely that when it comes to live power and just it's to my benefit to bring in. My value and time is better spent elsewhere. And so for me, looking at my capacity, sure, I have the ability and the capability, I have the tools, I have the equipment, but looking at my capacity, what is that maximum level of output that I can yield and deliver within my inherent limitations? And in that case, for me, subcontracting, hiring a professional to do that makes more sense. Now, I realize that's a little bit of an oversimplified example when you're looking at your own company's resources when we're talking about going after government contracts. So in the boxes below, you can see when I talk about ability, and not just personal, but let's apply it to our company now. So the ability is really about the people. That's our staff, the management, our key personnel, those experts that we bring in that really help move forward, those decision makers. The W-9 employees, And that refers to those contractors. So maybe we have experts that we come in, they have their own business and they come in for specific components when needed. It talks about our ability, we're looking at our staff training and certification, contingency plans, standard operating procedures. So this really kind of is that developing the ability of the company. So when we talk about capability then, now we're talking about our past performance, our completed projects. Things like having existing master subcontract agreements as opposed to just rewriting every single time. We're moving to that next level. We're developing contingency planning and resources. So not just basic contingency planning, but we're now extending those and developing those resources and making those operating agreements. We've moved our accounting system from possibly a QuickBooks as we're growing into government contracts, and maybe we're buying a more complex accounting system that is better suited to government contracting. But at a minimum, regardless of what, we have accounting systems, we have job codes, we have cost tracking mechanisms that are going to benefit us for the performance of government contracting. So when we move to that capacity, and again, remember it's that maximum level of output within inherent limitations. And really bonding capacity is the first thing that I think of, those maximum, those ceiling and project limitations if you're in the construction world for that surety bond capacity. What do we have available? Where is those bonding requirements tied up for projects that we have yet to complete? What are we looking at for our work in progress? Sure, we can go after a new contract, but do we have the manpower and the equipment available? When does this work have to be completed by? What projects do we have in place? Because ultimately, there's still only 24 hours in a day, no matter how much we think that we can tackle ourselves. And this is really applicable for those small businesses where the owner-operator is still tackling a lot of those responsibilities themselves, or in the case of the ANCs, where you have a developing subsidiary and currently there's only 1 or 2 employees within that subsidiary. We have those inherent limitations, those bottlenecks that kind of can stop that business expansion. So that ties back to that capacity. What are our financial resources? Do we have any sort of contingency financing in play or access to capital should it be needed to help gear up for a great opportunity? What kind of contingency resources do we have in play? Supply chain availability, and of course, those inherent limitations within our own company. Even from a management decision, if we see an opportunity, what type of processes or standard procedures do you have in play, and where do they create those hurdles and bottlenecks? So before we can start reaching out to another company, whether we want to do a mentor protege or we want to do that joint venture, we need to understand our own company's strengths and weaknesses so that we know what we're bringing to the table that we can use as those bargaining chips to develop those business relationships. And the better that we understand our own limitations and our strengths, what we can do well and what we've done well, especially if you're looking at business diversification or expansion, and where do you need, what is it that you need under this ability and capability column to be able to expand that business or move into a new arena or go after a larger contract? And how can that be filled? Is it through growing your own company, or is that risk share worth bringing in another partner? And so then really take a look at that internal so you know what you can bring to the table when negotiating with other companies to build these business relationships. Let's talk about looking for potential partners. Where do we find them? Of course, the dynamic small business search is a great way, especially if we want to stay within that small arena, but we still want that business growth. We can go into the dynamic small business search and look for other small businesses, especially if there is like a hub zone set aside or one of the subcategories other than just small business that you want to go after. And how would we know that it might be a set aside? is we can go, this is kind of like a little bit of a side trail, but we can look at agencies' procurement forecasts, and often the agencies will identify projects and identify where they plan what small business strategy they want to apply to that particular activity. So looking at these procurement forecasts, we can see that, and I'm just going to use a Forest Service, for example, that they have said, well, we have these contracts coming out and that we're going to go ahead and we've predetermined based on our market research when building our procurement forecast that these activities then are going to be hub zone set aside or 8A set aside. So if you don't have those certification, it gives you one, time to pursue that and get that in place, or two, if you're not qualified for a particular certification like 8A or service disabled veteran, then it allows you the opportunity to go into the dynamic small business search, build those business relationships and maybe come at that as a prime sub, or depending on hub zone, for example, for a joint venture to be hub zone, both of the businesses involved in that, two parent companies, also have to have that hub zone certification for that joint venture to automatically be deemed hub zone. Still paperwork process, it's not just an automatic stamp, but for example, this is part of that pre-planning when we're looking at our strengths or weaknesses. So we have another question here. Does Alaska PTAC help with searches for subcontracting? Absolutely, absolutely. For example, you offer consulting services for planning, group facilitation, community engagement. Could it help find opportunities for potential subs? Yes, we do. I have some old market research. It's been a while since I've done one, but absolutely, this is where working with one of the PTAC contract specialists, absolutely, we have various tools in our tool belt that we can help you. We also have Bid Match. If you're not familiar with that, you want to follow up. That's a solicitation search software. But yes, absolutely, we can set up one-on-one appointments and really teach you how to do that market research, how to find that. Because if just the dynamic small business search alone, that DSBS, it's used predominantly, its purpose was for contracting staff to be able to go out and find providers for whatever it is they needed. Plus it also had that socioeconomic classifications as a pre-filter. So we can do that. And of course, it works all across US, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So we can look at that. So again, if your business is moving into a different geographic region, you can go in and just select that state and limit down geographically by zip code or area code. Sorry, I was thinking cell phone, but couldn't remember what that first 3 digits was called, those area codes, to help really narrow down that geographic. And then you can come in and filter by whatever socioeconomic that you're looking for, or you can just simply do by search. So if you are a vendor and you don't necessarily, you sell stuff, and bear with me on my very professional terms here, but you have commodity sales, or you have a support service provider, such as like lumber supply or office supply, or not necessarily selling directly to the government, but your potential clients are going to be those contractors that need those supplies to be able to complete. Obviously, the DSBS is a great way to go in and find those businesses. The one thing with the DSBS is the search only returns small businesses, thus the small business search. SAM doesn't have quite the same search capacity based on NAICS codes for those large companies, but if you're looking for other small businesses, the DSBS is great. If you are a larger company and you're looking for subs, absolutely DSBS. We can also do SAM and do a search in SAM. The old central contractor registration had better filters like the dynamic small business search, where you could find those large businesses, but it's still a good search. The FPDS, the Federal Procurement Data System, is also a great way to find, especially if you're looking for contractors that have specific performance, because we can take those NAICS codes and we can see who's got the contracts. It's also a great way for helping you vet those potential teaming partners. So if you are already starting discussion with another company, we can go into FPDS if you have their unique entity identifier, formerly DUNS number, but if you have that unique entity identifier, we can look that up in FPDS and see what is their contracting history. So we can help verify, not only looking for, but we can then verify those companies that we've started to have that discussion with. Of course, there's also these business networking opportunities. And now that we are kind of turning a corner on that pandemic and we're starting to see more in-person events, hopefully this fall we'll kind of return to that. Those national conventions are starting to come back into being, and there's a lot of opportunity for building that business networking. And of course, we have those professional organization training or networking events as well. So looking for, but again, we can use those same things for vetting that potential teaming partners. Now I have CPARs listed, and we really can't, CPARs is kind of a closed system, but that is something that you could ask if you're looking at a potential company for teaming and you want to know what their CPARs says about them. You can ask for a CPARs report. It is not really there for you to be able to, you can see if there's any negative, there is some minimum, but most of that is a closed system. But when we're vetting the potential, so we're kind of talking about all these different areas where you can find and build, and really sometimes just looking at your direct competitors through a new lens of possibility. But then once we have that, we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence before entering those business relationships. And so again, you can use these same tools that we kind of already talked about to do that due diligence. But you should have a questionnaire. What are your concerns? And if, you know, it comes back to that same concept of negotiating your subcontracting agreements. You need to go through and make sure that there's that benefit and they get all of those requirements, those wants, those understandings to avoid miscommunication, getting all of that on paper. So a lot of great information. I just want to pull out a few other resources. Let me quick switch. So again, for some of the things that we talked about briefly, but I didn't go into a lot of details, I just wanted to show you the SBA sites. So here's the information for SBA and joint ventures and joint venture programs, processes, and to find a joint venture agreement. So we have that how to set up a joint venture, rules for joint ventures, and performance of work. Now this is of course through SBA, and SBA is kind of coming at this as JVs as an approved process, especially for those businesses in that 8A arena, and they're looking at that. And again, some of those requirements have eased up from what they were even just a year or so ago. But we can just Google SBA JV and you can find this page. I don't think I have this linked within the workshop. So I had mentioned the SBA All Small Mentor Protege program. Again, if you just enter SBA Mentor Protege, we have this here as well. This is an approval process to have an approved Mentor Protege program. Now you can have a Mentor Protege relationship and go through and use that form as a guideline, but not necessarily have it officially approved. So again, part of that business relationship and development from that long-term process. But if you want to have a joint venture form from a mentor protege, then you do need to have that approved. And as I had mentioned, so the most known and most often assumed when you say mentor protege is this SBA's All Small Mentor Protege program, and it really goes through and provides the basic information and application process. And again, this is stuff that PTAC can help you with to a point, but at some point in time, some of these I really feel that bringing in at least having one session with a attorney that specializes in government contracting can be really beneficial for all parties. And in some cases, if you have a mentor protege and they have in-house counsel, keep in mind that any in-house counsel for that mentor, that client confidentiality is for the benefit of that mentor, not automatically applied to you. So don't just completely rely on that in that circumstance. You might still want to go out and get your own attorney for that evaluation. But as I had mentioned, there are multiple mentor protege programs, and I just did a federal mentor protege program search. Department of Defense has one, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Homeland Security. So there are other options. And this really becomes part of that business development, looking at doing your market research. If there's a particular agency that looks like this is going to be your best long-term growth area, such as Department of Energy, and you're looking at that mentor protege, you might want to do that through their approval program. At least compare, contrast it to the SBA's all small. Other things that we talked about, I kind of mentioned the Govology. This is the Govology site. Again, don't forget that 2202 AK. It's just our year kind of backwards, sort of, 2202 AK. And if you don't remember after, you're welcome to email me or call us at PTAC, and we'll be happy to do that. Again, it's to our benefit having our clients reach out and use these Govology services. So we want to make sure that our subscription fees are really getting their money's worth out. Great workshops. And of course, often just there's a lot of great attorneys out there that have articles and newsletters. And, you know, as you find some of these, like the Schoonover Moriarty, they have great articles. This is where Matt Schoonover has done that affiliation workshop for us. It's on our PTAC On Demand. So I just wanted to let you know that, you know, there's more information than just my brief introduction to that. So we still have about 15 minutes left on our webinar. Let me pull back up the current slide. There we go. So if you have time or if you have any questions, be happy to address that now. Or if you kind of want to think about what we're saying and you have questions, here's how to reach PTAC staff. So the curtains have been pulled. Here's all of our direct contact information and email addresses, so you can reach any one of us here within our Alaska PTAC. So other than, sorry again about my brief, trying to choke myself fit in the middle of this presentation, is there any last discussions, questions, comments? Well, if not, you're always welcome to reach out to us after the fact. Again, you have the PTAC confirmation, contact information. Don't forget to check out some of those Govology workshops. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and close this webinar.